Wensy had been the only child of two reclusive yet loving parents, the original Ma and Pa Shadefeet. They had taken on the name after Pa, Eunice Proudfoot, had renounced his inheritance in order to elope with Dina Bothan, and against all advice, staked the Shady Hollow as their own. It was a rough few years as they successfully avoided predators, starvation, and bearing children while they tamed the area bit by bit. Eventually, Wensy was born, leading to an increased resolve to make both the Hollow and the name of Shadefeet endure. While the progress on the land was fruitful, it seemed either Eunice's loins or Dina's womb was not. No tincture, technique, or moon of the month bore any results for the couple, so they poured their knowledge, hearts, and souls into their only daughter. It wasn't until the trade run with her father, when she met Paxson, another hobbit trying to forget his name and past, that they dared hope for a lineage. Upon courting Wensy and eventually learning of her family's past, he developed not only a love for her, but a kinship with the name, family, and hollow of Shadefeet. Within a year, the two were married, and Pax joined the three of them in the Hollow, where they expanded upon the burrow and put his skills to use for the family. The new couple spent the next year pouring themselves into cultivating their home while deepening their bond and understanding of one another. Paxson's archery skills more than doubled their normal haul from Eunice's trapping. The increase in kills meant not only did they eat better, but they had extra furs and jerky to sell downriver at Deep Hollow. Shortly after their first anniversary, Atehn began showing in her mother's belly. It was easy, sitting on the bench in the front garden while sipping her afternoon tea, to imagine that this was that pregnancy. She had sat in the exact same spot often during it, as well as the following one, and she expected the habit to persist until she had her last, whatever number that ended up being. Two complimentary giggles sounded off behind her and to the right. Her eyes remained closed, but her face broke out into a smile. Wensy's girls were her world, and while she wouldn't mind another, she hoped the incoming one would be a boy for his father's sake. Otherwise, she feared she would lose Atehn to his hunts and river trekking. But perhaps if he had a son. A squeal of terror interrupted her thoughts, and she started with her eyes opening in time to see Jabala fleeing head over heels across the lawn. Behind her, Atehn stalked low to the ground on all fours, sniffing about, extending each limb in an exaggerated manner like some enormous spider. The tinier hobbit ran to the bank of the river and turned in exaggerated distress to face her pursuer. Atehn scampered in a zigzag pattern towards the cowering, giggling child until leaping upon her with a gentle tackle. The two squealed in different tones as Atehn pretended to chew on her sister while tickling her furiously. The two eventually collapsed in a heap, panting heavily and laughing between gasps. No, Atehn resembled her mother in many ways, but she had her father's soul. A begrudging acknowledgement Wensy had only recently begun grappling with. Still, she was too young to go on hunts. The little thing would happily go fishing with her father, but afterwards would leave until the fillets were prepared. There's little chance of her actually letting loose a killing shot, so maybe this will end up with her facing reality and simply having an archery hobby. Perhaps she'd be content with local tournaments at the seasonal fairs while learning the intricacies of the apothecarial arts and skills of homesteading. A cackle of insane glee broke the silence before the eldest instigated another bout of tickling, followed immediately by Jabala's own squeaking laughter. As much as Wensy enjoyed Jabala beginning to show interest, she had just learned to walk and could barely speak more than a few sentences, whereas Atehn had become a complimentary assistant over the years. That is, until the fireside stories had finally won her over from the safety of the burrow and garden to wander alone in hopes for adventures. She tried various things to lure her back in and reinvest interest, but they were becoming less successful, and her daughter spent much of the time looking out the window. Since Pax would be gone for days at a time on the river trading, hunting, or fishing, Wensy didn't object when his and Aten's playtime escalated to sparring with the carved weapons. She simply required that Atehn have a shield as well, which her father happily supplied, and just like that, her apprentice became a rangerling. Jabala finally wriggled free of her sister's grasp, scrambled from the riverbank, and began sprinting across the yard towards her mother. Instead of giving chase, Atehn slunk along the bank until she was obscured by the grasses and shrubberies as she watched her prey scamper away. Wensy, smiling broadly, outstretched her arms to receive the fleeing child, who was out of breath as she sighed between tremors of laughter. They pulled back from their embrace, gazing at each other lovingly, as Wensy began attempting to reset the tiny girl's tousled hair. Looking into her daughter's eyes, Wensy was overwhelmed with the sense that each of her children would sort themselves out, all of them a unique hodgepodge of their parents, with a will and spirit of their own. She kissed Jabala's forehead, and both of their worries were fluttering away when she heard soft footsteps a few paces behind her. Atehn had successfully lurked through the yard and was crossing the last little distance to the doorway when her mother casually, yet loudly stated, "I hope a certain someone isn't about to pillage the fruit bowl without picking anything to replenish it." Atehn cringed as her mother continued, "Especially seeing as certain someone didn't gather eggs this morning, nor milk Jobby, and neither did they gather sticks for the cook fire yet." The sneaky slacker slumped over as if dead from her mother's fatal ambush of chores, and a hollow groan escaped her lips. "I told you there would be a trade-off if you decided the outdoors was where you belonged instead of studying," her mother said calmly. "Now get to it, darling." Atehn feigned death for only a moment more before grudgingly pushing herself back up to begin tromping off to the hen hutches. By the time the sky's hue had started shifting to red, the eggs, cranberries, and goat's milk had all been gathered, and Atehn was sulking around the southwestern end of the hollow, half-heartedly picking up a second bundle of firewood. She knew if she had hurried from the beginning, there would have been plenty of time to return to the old forest, but every task was distracted by her precarious experience there. She didn't want to tell her parents until she found out if they already knew anything about the talking trees. Besides, no one was likely to notice the hole in the briar patch since she was the only one to go back in the hollow recently, so far as she knew. She crested the short hill that obscured her view of the burrow, and the last rays of sunlight tickled her face, to which she smiled, sighing deeply. It seemed like such a perfectly peaceful, boring place to call home, she thought to herself. I used to think it was absolutely nothing like the stories Pa tells. In his tales, there's always something exciting happening. New lands to explore, a burglar to catch, a loved one to rescue, a monster to slay. Something, her heart cried within her. But today, I found out that adventure has been waiting for me this whole time, just in my backyard. Her thoughts stilled as the last sunbeams melted into the glowing sky. She turned slowly, looking from the riverside burrow towards the old forest, and from the darkness, an idea she had been struggling to ignore came back to her. The best adventurers always take care of the rest of the group. It's the impulsive ones you gotta watch out for. A moral from one of Paul's stories echoed from her memory. Perhaps Ma was right about me taking on more duties around the house, especially with our group ready to expand any day now. Maybe I ought not tempt fate too much by keeping the old forest a secret. Something moved down the hill to her right. If her eyes were not adjusted, she wouldn't have noticed anything at all. She stood frozen, allowed her eyes to relax further, and saw it again. It was a long, thick shape that seemed to glide close to the ground a pace or two at a time. It had slunk from the hole she had made and was cautiously working its way through the hollow towards the burrow. Her guilt and fear came over her like a thick quilt, smothering her courage and rage against this intruder. The silhouette was almost halfway through the hollow when the faint echo of her sister's voice pricked her ears. Her heart and resolve pounded with protective fury. She knelt quickly and silently, deposited the would-be firewood on the ground in front of her. Then she reached to her belt, but found her sheath empty. The precious faux blade and shield were still piled with her bow and quiver on the northeastern side of the home where she had placed them before pouncing on Jabala earlier, so as not to hurt her. With horror, Atehn realized that her earlier recklessness may have actually killed them all instead, on the very eve her father was due to return. She dashed with as much stealth as she could tolerate in her panicked state, reluctantly keeping a safe distance behind the malevolent shadow she had unwittingly unleashed upon her family.